Good afternoon, everybody. We're ready to start the webinar. I want to welcome everyone to this AFRICAP project webinar this afternoon. I want to run through very briefly etiquette for participating in this Zoom online meeting. You'll note that your audio and video are automatically disabled. As the speakers are presenting this afternoon, if you want to ask a question or raise a point for discussion amongst the group, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll pick up those questions in the order that they're received, and speakers will address these. We'll have question and answer for all speakers at the end, so the speakers will complete their presentations and we'll open up the Q&A function. Please contribute vigorously and enthusiastically with your questions. For general comments on the content as it's being presented, please use the chat function and ensure your message is directed to the entire group. And this session is being recorded. If you have any questions or concern, you have a contact point here for the AFRICAP project. The AFRICAP project is agriculture and food systems resilience, increasing capacity and advising policy, funded through the Global Challenges Research Fund of the UK Research and Innovation and partners. AFRICAP is a major international program that aims to make agriculture and food production in sub-Saharan Africa more productive, sustainable, and resilient to climate change. We work in partnership with local organizations and governments in 4 focal countries: Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia, to create an evidence base to support new country-specific policies. AFRICAP aims to help countries reduce poverty and hunger, improving livelihood and economic development whilst addressing the broader aims of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this diagram highlights the project structure and 4 cross-cutting themes: farming systems, climate smart development pathways, policy design and implementation, and training and capacity building. AFRICAP is led by the University of Leeds and is funded by the UK Research and Innovation Global Challenges Research Fund. The AFRICAP project is part of a wider set of activities at University of Leeds, and together with our partners from around the world of the Global Food and Environment Institute. The Institute is an interdisciplinary research institute which is working to achieve a radically different global food system, one which works with the planet and provides everybody access to safe, nutritious food. The aim of the Institute is to develop enduring solutions that facilitate transformative change to create a food system which is socially just, climate smart, and goes beyond sustainability, a food system that can adapt vigorously to Earth. My name is Steve Banward. I'm director of the Global Food and Environment Institute. I'm your host this afternoon. I want to introduce the topic today and our speakers. This is improving soil health through climate smart agriculture, a key to resilient farming systems and food security in sub-Saharan Africa. Efforts to meet the growing demand for food across sub-Saharan Africa has led to unsustainable land management practices that cause soil degradation and weaken the resilience of agricultural systems. Soil health is key to building more climate resilient agricultural systems and can be improved through a range of climate smart agriculture practices. This webinar will focus on AFRICAP's efforts to review and extend the empirical evidence base to inform context-specific climate smart agriculture recommendations and policies for a resilient agriculture and food security in sub-Saharan Africa. The use of soil health indicators as a measure of the effectiveness of implemented CSA practices such as conservation agriculture, cover cropping, mulching, crop rotation, intercropping, minimum or zero tillage, crop residue management, amongst other practices, in maize-based systems, and soil and water conservation, such as contour planting, terraces and bunds, planting pits, irrigation, in Highland African systems will be discussed. The webinar will also explore strategies for upscaling CSA practices through enhanced farmer participation in the chain of climate smart agriculture activities, ranging from intervention design to community evaluation of impacts. The webinar will close with a response from discussant Dr. Christian Tierfelder, Principal Cropping Systems Agronomist and Strategic Leader specializing in Conservation Agriculture Systems Research with CMET, followed by question and answers facilitated by myself and we'll pick up contributions from all of the panel members at that time in terms of responses to questions. Our first speaker today will be Professor Andy Dougal. He's Professor of Environmental Sustainability at the University of Leeds. Andy Dougal is an applied environmental change researcher and an experienced academic leader with 30 years of experience across Southern African farming systems that integrates a range of disciplines, including soil science, ecology, climate services, and environmental social sciences. He has developed innovative approaches for integrating research methodologies that use scientific approaches together with local participation to ensure locally relevant research output with studies applied in a range of socio-ecological settings with a focus on sub-Saharan African farming systems. He has successfully built long-lasting partnerships with a range of African universities and partner organizations through a strong commitment to impact, capacity building, and research training. In the GCRF-AFRICAP project, he is the Malawi country coordinator and work package leader for studies on climate smart agriculture and soil health benefits. Our second speaker is Dr. Samuel Ease. He's the GCRF-AFRICAP Research Fellow on Soil Science of African Agricultural Systems. Dr. Ease is a GCRF-AFRICAP Fellow on Soil Science with focus on the impacts of climate smart agricultural practices on the physical, chemical, and biological indicators of soil health. Before joining the AFRICAP project, Samuel worked as a postdoctoral impact translation fellow for the Yorkshire Integrated Catchment Solutions Program, ICASP, in the UK, where he investigated the impacts of different land management interventions in the UK on soil health. His main research interest is understanding the impacts of agricultural land management practices and climate change on the soil's continued capacity to maintain important functions such as crop production, climate change mitigation, water and quality regulation. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Soil Science, the Federal University of Technology, Owerri, an MSc in Sustainable Environmental Management, University of Greenwich, and a PhD in Physical Geography from University of Leeds. Our third speaker is Tirza Hermans. She's a NERC-funded PhD researcher at the University of Leeds, working on conservation agriculture scaling in Malawi in collaboration with International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CMIT. Her PhD research focuses on the conservation agriculture scaling process and associated smallholder farmer decision-making, thereby gaining understanding on the processes of change, knowledge interactions, and translation from research to communities. She has a BSc in Liberal Arts and Sciences with a major in Environmental Science from Amsterdam University College, the Netherlands, and an MSc Physical Geography and Ecosystem Dynamics from Lund University, Sweden. Other projects she is working on include UK Climate Change Risk Assessment, International Dimensions Chapter, and Red Cross project on the integration of local knowledge on early warning, early action with scientific forecasting, with case studies in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. Our respondent today, I'm very pleased to warmly welcome Christian Thierfelder. He is Principal Cropping Systems Agronomist and Strategic Leader specializing in conservation agriculture systems research with CIMMYT. He is based in Harare, Zimbabwe, and covers the whole Southern African region. He trained as a soil scientist at the Christian Albrechts University of Kiel, Germany, and he did his PhD project with the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, CIAT, on soil conservation in Cali, Colombia. He received his PhD with the University of Hohenheim, Germany in 2003. Since 2004, he has been involved in conservation agriculture-related projects led by CIMMYT in Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. He has conducted applied and strategic research on farm and on station to adapt conservation agriculture to the needs and environments of smallholder farmers in Southern Africa. Since 2009, he has been project leader of several large conservation agriculture projects. He guided the research programs of 25 BSc, MSc, and PhD students, has published more than 85 research articles in peer-reviewed, high-impact journals and books. And with that, I'll turn over to our first speaker, Professor Dougal.
Thank you, Steve. I'll just share the slides there. So welcome all and good afternoon from Leeds. As Steve said, I'm Andy Dougal, and together with my colleagues from Leeds, Tirza and Samuel, we're going to give you a quick overview of some of the work we've done in the AFRICAP project in relation to our studies to evaluate ways to improve soil health through climate smart agriculture initiatives. And as we said there, it will focus on conservation agriculture in Malawi, in particular from myself, Tirza, and a little bit from Samuel. And then also Samuel will take us into the Highland region of Tanzania, looking at soil water conservation issues there. So hopefully something for various different parts of the world and for Christian to reflect upon in terms of how the empirical work we've done here in this project and others feeds in with the wider UN, United Nations push around climate smart agriculture. So just to start from that global level in terms of the push to try and make our farming systems, our agricultural systems more climate smart. What I want to stress is, well, what does that mean in terms of ways to increase productivity? So it's great for our sites this year, seeing really good harvests coming along in Malawi and Zambia in particular recently, but also ways that we can add resilience into the farming systems, in particular in the face of climate change. So in relation to increased heat stress that these systems are facing, but also dry spells and drought events that are particularly impactful on maize systems. Whilst at the same time, climate smart also increases, it looks at ways of increasing the carbon storage in the system, both the soils itself and also in the farming system more widely, so trees in the landscape and other elements like that. So you can see there that climate smart agriculture includes a range of approaches. We'll look at conservation agriculture and soil water conservation today, similar issues around agroforestry, and last month's AFRICAP talk, which looked at the use of improved drought tolerant seeds. Just to stress, if you want more information on this work, we have produced a briefing note on soil health, which outlines some of the papers. Samuel's work is published already. Tirza's work is due out very, very shortly in the Journal of Environmental Management. So she'll produce that as a quick overview of work that is out in the next week or two. I just wanted to start with an image from the IPCC's special report on climate change and land, because really looking at those interconnections of the climate challenges with land management is important. And this slide just highlights some of the issues where you can see the dark blue areas, which are areas where the IPCC are highlighting that there is a large potential for mitigation benefits from improved land management. And it highlights things like agroforestry, like increased soil organic carbon content. And really what we're looking at today are approaches that are aimed at trying to improve that organic carbon content to help with both carbon storage itself, but also water retention in soils to help sustain yields through dry spells. So these are highlighted as real areas of potential. Some of the early work I'm going to refer to here at Leeds was led by somebody called Peter Stewart, who's now at the World Agroforestry Centre, ICRAF, based in Nairobi. And Pete helped us do some meta-analyses together with Christian and others in terms of the studies that have been produced across a whole range of field trial sites, often on government research stations, on CGIR, centre sites and things like that, to try and look at the impact of the move to conservation agriculture, which I didn't define earlier, but is basically the reduced or zero tillage of the soil, so reduced tillage of the soil surface, enhanced cover of mulch and compost on the surface, so you have continuous surface cover, and also intercropping, so the growth of maize, for example, with cowpea or groundnuts or other leguminous crops is particularly important. And when we've looked at the findings from field trial sites in relation to the ability of conservation agriculture to help withstand heat stress in maize, we see that that sort of global meta-analysis study shows that the CA sites compared to the neighbouring conventional agriculture tilled sites improve maize yields under heat stress when we have in sites with negative moisture balance, so in particular in the drier areas of the continent and indeed globally in the tropical regions, but also it's especially beneficial on sandier soils with medium to low clay contents and when it's associated with low rates of nitrogen fertilization. other similar studies are coming out now. So there was a study out in Nature Geoscience last month by Su et al., which highlighted a similar finding in terms of CA stands having more than a 50% chance of outperforming the neighbouring conventional tillage in those drier parts of the world, but only when it's been associated with good residue management. And I think it's this wider sort of good sustainable land management that's particularly interesting. The other work we did in our early studies in Malawi, in this case, in Chitedzi, as you can see from the image there, is we simulated extra heat and extra drying by building some drying shelters at the Chitedzi site. And again, that showed that conservation agriculture significantly was able to withstand the extra heat and extra dryness that environment was put in place. Yield benefits from across the studies in Africa tend to start to show a benefit after 5 years, and that is focused in the dry years in particular. So that was the position from trial sites. What I really want to do now, and Tieza will add more detail to this as she follows from me, is just highlight some of the differences when we go from a farm trial into the wider farm system. And in particular, also touch on the politics of conservation agriculture here, which is work I've been looking at over the last 10 years, really, in both Malawi and Zambia. So just to highlight some issues there, that there are national task forces that have been put in place to try and encourage farmer uptake of conservation agriculture. So Malawi had a national CA task force that evolved into a climate smart agriculture alliance. It's still embedded in various of the national policies and wider statements to try and encourage it. And yet less than 4% of Malawian farmers are following this sort of approach. The reasons for that are how it's been, partly how it's been sold. Has it been sold in terms of increased yields every year, and that maybe in a good rainfall year like we see this year, the differential will be very limited. There'll be very limited difference, and that the main differences stem in the dry years. That also some of the real benefits and reasons for uptake aren't in relation to just the yield itself, but in terms of the amount of labor that's required within the household. So in particular, we showed in a study looking at the 2015-16 El Nino event, the Ju et al. Paper reference there, that actually access to labor was the main factor constraining the success of conservation agriculture practices, and that you needed good community health services aligned to sensible, clear agricultural extension advice to see the sort of positive benefits of increased resilience that we saw in Malawi in that year. And it's the same with the work that Stephen Whitfield led in Zambia, that really we see the benefits of conservation agriculture more widely in the Zambian case, and it's there where it's been integrated alongside advice on agricultural inputs, seed varieties, fertilizers, and crop residue management together, whereas perhaps in the Malawi case, the emphasis of government has been much more around inputs programs, so the farm input subsidy program, and now the affordable inputs program that the Malawian government are leading in terms of their support of the agricultural sector, have focused much more on inputs and commercialization as the route to sustained agricultural outputs, rather than building on the local knowledge that is there around how we manage the land, how by reducing tillage and keeping the sort of surface coverage of mulch and the like, that we can, you know, almost farm in that traditional way, farming in God's way, sometimes it's referred to, and put in that sort of extra resilience into the landscape through those land management practices. They are mentioned in the latest big sort of national policy documents from Malawi. So they've just produced a Vision 2063 document from the National Planning Commission, which does recognize the need for soil and water conservation, conservation agriculture, and improve the area under agroforestry. But the main emphasis of the government reports remains on use of irrigation systems, technologies to try and advance and commercialize agriculture across the country. So in a way, the sort of role of enhancing smallholder ability to manage the soils isn't inherent in those sort of documents as yet. So just as my final slide, I just wanted to highlight some of the research needs as we've seen them here. One is that, yes, we need to understand the soils better. And Samuel will talk about some of his work. He's pictured there in the Chitetse laboratory and doing some of the soil physics and soil structure work. That is important to understand how land management affects soil properties so that we can use that in an iterative conversation to produce joint knowledges. So I've purposely put knowledges rather than knowledge. It's not just about scientific knowledge, it's about the knowledge of the local farming system, how that links to health systems in the area, how that links to the cultural understanding of farmer practices. And to actually tie those two things together is a key research need. The other key research need that we've studied to some extent through the Malawi work, and we will hopefully continue to study in future years, is to understand the institutional positioning of land management advice and of policies and how they affect farmer practices on the ground. So that's kind of the work I've summarized there, my work in the past. I'm now working as part of a large project with the University of Pretoria called the Food Systems Research Network for Africa, which offers 2-year fellowships for anybody from 10 partner universities in Africa. If you want to study these things more with us, please do get in touch to look at these things going forward, and we'll take this sort of politics of this forward as well as the science itself. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and pass over to Tieza, who's going to take up the story from the Malawian work that we've done at CIMMYT sites there.
Right. So yeah, so as Andy said, I'm going to be talking about integrated soil health assessments that we tried in 2 Malawian sites. So first, why did we try an integrated soil health assessment? Basically to try to combine soil science and local knowledge, local experience, in order to contextualize the understanding of conservation agriculture impact on soil health. So moving, as Andy mentioned, from research trials to farming communities. And secondly, to improve our understanding of farmer decision-making on these land management practices and the role that soil health plays in that. So the work we did took place in 2 communities in Malawi, Mwansambo and Lemu. These 2 communities are part of an on-farm trial network by CIMMYT. And within these communities, 6 farmers hosted an on-farm trial. And each on-farm trial consisted out of a conventional practice, so the ridge and furrow system, and 2 forms of conservation agriculture, one in a rotation and the second one also with an intercrop element. So what is an integrated assessment of soil health? Basically, it consisted out of 4 steps. The first one discussing the impact of conservation agriculture on soil health with the farmers, so very qualitative exercise. Secondly, then, based on those conversations, identifying the soil health indicators as they were used by the farmers to assess what is good and what is bad and what does work and what does not work. And then we compared that with soil science literature. So looking at what indicators are normally used to measure soil health. The third step was actually taking these measurements with the help of farmers on the on-farm trials. And then in the end, bringing that back together. So checking what measurements did we get and how did that compare with the discussions at the start. And from the start, it was already clear that this needs a lot of iterations of these steps. It's not a perfect step framework. And very importantly, to check in with sort of assumptions we make based on knowledge and what counts and what does not count. Because the goal here was to really look at farmer perceptions and how that resulted in the decision making. So for the rest of this, I will go through these steps and show you how that worked out. So the first step was soil health farmer observation. So very much the qualitative work and the discussions. And it was very clear that all the practices, so CA, as Andy mentioned, consists out of 3 practices, and they discussed them separately. So starting with the residues, there were positive things. For example, that residues improve soil fertility, adds organic material, and improve soil moisture. Some worries in terms of that it attracts organisms or that it's not good for groundnut as a perception. And residues in particular were important also as a sort of a trade-off in the decision making. So the flatland, so the minimum tillage, only works when you have enough residues. Otherwise, the soil would be exposed to the sun and get hard. The second practice, the crop diversification, mainly had positive associations in terms of the leaves decompose and improve fertility. And then the last one is the ridge making, so the minimum tillage, which was the most contested one in terms of that there were negatives and positives, that no-till means that the soil is not shaken, and so it cannot wash away. So the fertility also does not wash away. There were also positive very much with the ridges in the terms that when you use a hoe, it actually aerates the soil and makes it soft and redistributes the soil fertility. So this was a more contested one. Go. So this is the second step where based on these discussions, we were able to identify the soil health indicators as used by the farmers. So for example, hard and soft soil. And this then we compared, which you can see on the right side, with the literature. And in that way, we could see what is related. And that's what the letters in this table mean. For example, C is related on carbon, N is related on nitrogen. And you can see from the farmers, we also find a lot of plant indicators as a sort of proxy indicators for soil. So this is then the third step, doing the actual soil measurements. And we tried to involve farmers as much as we could in terms of taking these measurements. So for example, infiltration we did on the fields, as you can see in the photo, soil moisture probe, and for soil structure, we had to do part in the lab and part as a visual evaluation, which is the map you can see here on the right, where we used feeling and looking at the soil based on photos. There were also some that we could not do in the field, and we had to take those back to the lab, but at least we tried to involve that in the discussions and the feedback. So I will shortly go through some of the soil moisture measurements that we then got. And this is before then the last step where we feed that back into the discussions. So for carbon, we did not find a significant result, but for ammonium and nitrite and nitrate, we actually found significantly higher values in the conventional systems. And infiltration, we found significantly higher value in the CA systems, as you can see here. Some of the other measurements, the structure. So for structure, we only saw a marginal difference for the CA systems. But when we did the visual exercise, we sort of connected it, and there it was found that the CA soil was more stable and softer. The moisture readings were significantly lower in the conventional system, and yield we only found to be significantly higher in Monsambo, so only in one location. So this is the last step, where we look at the integrated assessment and bringing together the measurements with the discussions we had at the start. So for example, we saw a soil structural change with significant improvements in infiltration and moisture and yield. That's based on the measurements, as I just showed them. And if we then compare that to the discussions we had at the start, we mainly saw that this fits with sort of the farmer observations on the residues in terms of preventing erosion and improving the softness and the moisture. So connecting that back to some of the statements we saw at the start and how important these residues are in the trade-off with minimum tillage. So the second example then is that we found these higher exchangeable ammonium and nitrate values. And this corresponded, or very much came up in the discussion with the farmers, as that positive thing of ridges redistributing the nutrients. And again, this is very much about perspectives. So how does that lead then to the decision making? One example that we found in the discussion is that the perceived benefits of the residues in terms of adding something positive, but that in association with the positive side of the ridges as redistributing the nutrients led to a popular practice of burying the residues in the ridges. And of course, there were other reasons around why just having enough residues to implement no-till might not be possible. But from a soil health perspective, this was sort of a midway that was created. And so it really showed that there's that nuance in decision making, and that CA information and observation did lead to a different decision making, just not exactly what was promoted or what was expected. So I will hand over to Sam now, who will go a little bit more about the soil
Thank you very much, Tiezi. I will just share my screen quickly. So I will be focusing on the importance of soil health to the achievement of the objectives of climate-smart agriculture. As Andy introduced in the beginning, climate-smart agriculture aims to achieve three key objectives, which are increasing agricultural productivity, increasing resilience to climate change, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And soil health, a healthy soil is one that performs these functions. It sustains agricultural productivity, promotes environmental quality, and reduces greenhouse gas emission. So that is why it is important to consider soil health while assessing climate-smart agricultural practices. One, choosing what practices deliver these benefits. So that's what I'll be focusing on in my presentation. And the first thing is to know whether the practices considered as climate-smart agriculture benefit soil health. Do they really offer these soil health benefits? And to answer that question, we'll look at what the indicators are. Tieze has discussed some of them. And then conservation, I'll give a further details on what we did in Malawi, and then end my presentation with our case study in Tanzania. So what are soil health indicators? They are attributes of soil properties that are sensitive to management practices, which is why we're using them to monitor the impact of climate-smart agriculture. Because when you change your management activities, you want to know whether there's a change in what you are measuring. So soil health indicators are those properties that respond to changes in management. There are also soil properties that correlate well with these functions, which are the objectives of climate-smart agriculture, ecosystem functions. For example, if we take soil structure, which is an indicator that Tieze mentioned in her presentation, having a good understanding of the structure of a given soil gives you an idea of the moisture, the movement of water in the soil, how water infiltrates and moves in the soil, nutrient retention capacity of the soil, and even the activities of soil organisms. And another thing is that soil health indicators should be easily understandable by the land managers, the farmers themselves. In the literature, a whole lot of indicators are being used. So this is a study by Berman and others who reviewed over 50 literatures looking at common indicators of soil health. So that you can see from this diagram that there are so many indicators and the frequency at which they are being used. But to tell a farmer to measure all of these parameters won't be easy. Even as a researcher, it will be difficult to measure everything. So within AFRICAP, we focus on three key indicators. One is structure and hydraulic properties of soil. Second is chemical fertility and organic matter. And third is biodiversity. So in Malawi, the same sites that Tieze mentioned, the farmer trials in Lemu and Mwasambu, and then in Agricultural Research Station in Chitetse, we measured other soil parameters in addition to the parameters that Tieze measured in the farmer's field. For structure, we looked at moisture retention, and then the pore characteristics. So apart from measuring how aggregated the soils are visually, in the lab, we measured the pores, because when you measure the moisture infiltration, the infiltration of water into the soil, another thing is to know whether the water moves freely in the soil and whether they can be retained for crops to make use of them. So we measure that in different trials, different CA trials, comparing them with conventional practices. So we targeted our key indicators, which are structure, carbon and nutrients, and then biodiversity. And what we found was that apart from visually the soils under conservation agriculture being more aggregated, they have more pore spaces. And then the water storage pores were also higher under conservation agriculture compared to the conventional practices. And the water retention capacity was also higher under conservation agriculture plots. And then for the carbon stock, there was no difference. There was no significant difference in carbon stock. But what we found was that when we looked at the aggregates, we found that the macro aggregates, those greater than 250 micrometers, stored more carbon in them. So sometimes it is important to look further rather than just concluding that without differences in carbon stock, bulk carbon stock, the CA or other management practices do not have effects. If we go further, looking at storage of carbon in aggregate, we could see other impacts that are not easily detected. So we found that CA increased macro aggregation, which indicates improved soil structure, and then the carbon in the macro aggregates as well. And then for the fertility, conservation agricultural plots increased nitrogen, total nitrogen, available potassium, and then the reaction, there was the increase. Acidity was reduced in some of those conservation agricultural plots. Then for the biodiversity, that's the work we are still doing now, looking at the impact of conservation agriculture on the macrofauna, the earthworms, and then the microfauna, bacteria and fungal abundance and diversity. In Tanzania, we looked at the East Usambara Mountains, the highlands there. So as Andy introduced, climate smart agriculture is not one practice, it's a range of different practices, and it depends on the site characteristics that determines what practices to implement in those sites. So we've talked about CA in Malawi. Then in the highlands, they are implementing soil and water conservation practices because they are in the highlands where the slopes are steep slopes. There's high runoff and erosion. So the practices there are different. So in the highlands there, we looked at the impacts of terracing, contour barriers across slopes to reduce runoff on the same indicators of soil health that we are using in AFRICAP. And the approach there was to look at farmers' observations first and then do the conventional soil testing. So we wanted to understand whether farmers are aware and use soil health indicators. And what we found was that farmers do use soil health indicators, not just that they are aware of it, but it influences their management decisions. So based on soil color, when the color changes, from red to black, for example, the farmers believe that that's an indication of improved health. But if it is the other way around, if the color changes from black to red, then the health has declined. And then they add farmyard manure in order to remedy the soil ill health. So that's what that's the farmers' understanding of soil health and how that links to their management practices. But what we found was that only 2 indicators influence farmers' management decisions. So after that, we went ahead to do the conventional soil testing to compare fields that are under soil and water conservation practices with those that do not have those practices implemented. So, and the key practices we focused on were Fanyaju terracing, which are just trenches dug across slopes with soils thrown uphill and stabilized with grasses to reduce runoff. So we looked at that with addition of farmyard manure and incorporation of crop residues in the soil. And what we found was that, one, the farmers themselves believe that when they implemented those practices, there was a change in soil color and crop yield. So implementation of Fanyaju terracing with organic manure increased yield and also led to soil color change from red to black, which to them was improvement in soil health. And then our conventional soil testing also shows that implementation of these practices improved the pore spaces in soil, which indicates improvement in soil structure and hydraulic properties. And that agrees with what the farmers have observed in their fields. Now, back to the question, our question of whether conservation, climate-smart agriculture delivers soil health benefits. Well, based on the studies we've conducted so far, we can say that yes, it does. Our findings suggest it does. But one thing to take into account is that it may take time. Andy mentioned about 5 years. It's not something that you implement in a cropping season and expect to get all the benefits in that cropping season. It may take time. And another thing is that CSA, climate smart agriculture, is not a single practice. So because we found evidence that conservation agriculture improved soil health in Malawi and in the sites where we studied, you don't just move that to other places just because it does that, because it will depend on the site characteristics there. Andy mentioned that it's better in sandy soils under stress conditions. These are the things that needs to be considered before you implement a particular practice. So that needs to be noted that CSA is not a single practice and depends on consideration of the site-specific characteristics to choose appropriate practices that will deliver best results. Another thing is to be mindful of false negative results. One, from our study, we found that, okay, there's no increase in carbon stock, for example, but then when you dig deeper, you find that there's increase in macro aggregation and the storage of carbon in them. So if you stop at the top saying, okay, no impact, you've stopped from there, you are missing the benefits of those practices. Another thing is that when implemented in a place that is not suitable, the benefits won't be achieved. And that will give you a result that is not a good representation of what that practice is promoted for. Finally, we need to involve farmers in monitoring soil health. That's one way to increase awareness, because when the farmers are involved, they are more interested, they understand what is happening, and it helps them to make decisions that are more appropriate. Thank you very much.
All right. I guess it is my turn now. I'm having the pleasure and honor now to try to bind those presentations together. And before I do that, I would like to give you a little bit of history of this work. And I will focus mainly on Malawi, because this is where most of the research that has been portrayed has happened. When we started in 2004 in this area, promoting conservation agriculture systems, this was practically unknown. There has been a little bit of previous work by Sasakawa Global 2000, and they introduced that concept in Malawi. But their focus was mainly on high input packages, because they were mainly funded through Monsanto, so seed, fertilizer, and specifically herbicides were amongst those technologies that were promoted. And that often neglected the real interest and needs of the farmers. We could say from today's perspective that they promoted mostly green revolution technologies. Our focus in CIMMYT was primarily on the biophysical and socioeconomic aspects of conservation agriculture in Malawi, with the first project, which was named Facilitating the Widespread Adoption of Conservation Agriculture for Smallholder Farmers. Our aim was to show successful examples and provide sort of a proof of concept of the system to farmers. So through our collaborative research efforts with the Ministry of Agriculture and the regional NGO Total Land Care, we managed to achieve that interest to develop this proof of concept. And we can confirm what Samuel just confirmed as well. CA is indeed a climate smart agriculture system. It conserves more soil moisture, it improves specific soil health indicators. Major benefits have been observed on lighter textured soils and leading to greater drought tolerance and reduced heat stress. Above all, CA systems have also immediate benefits. Reduced labor for land preparation, for example, because ridging, the predominant land preparation technique that is common in Malawi, is very labor intensive. Requires between 25 to 35 labor days, and farmers have to move something like 500 or more tons per hectare of soil every year, because those ridges are done annually. Also, we introduced improved weed control strategies with herbicides that further reduce the labor. So this led to greater profitability of the system. And in the longer term, we could also find out that CA systems increase crop yields. However, unlike in the Americas or Australia, CA was not driven by a reduced production cost. For example, in these places, machinery, fuel savings were the main drivers of adoption. And just to talk to farmers and say your soil will be better in some 3 or 5 years' time was often not good enough for them. This brings us to the research that we have been conducting in recent years, also in collaboration with the University of Leeds. While we have managed to cover many of the biophysical aspects of CA, research in Southern Africa documented in numerous peer-reviewed publications, there is still lack of widespread adoption or slow adoption, and this remained a thorny issue. Maybe it was too optimistic to believe that in this environment we could easily promote and get adoption of an improved but knowledge-intensive crop management system like CA. However, this challenge has not only been an issue with CA or with climate-smart agriculture, but also with all other modern agriculture technologies, being agroforestry, cereal legume rotations, stress-tolerant seed, even fertilizer, although its benefits are clear and have been widely proven, is not adopted to a large extent due to other constraints such as markets, availability, and cash constraints. And these are all outside the benefits of increased productivity. So lack of adoption of CEA is not entirely a problem of the system itself, but more a general problem of the context in which we want to extend such improved agriculture technologies. Adoption is a complex and dynamic process involving many social and economic considerations. Several adoption pathways have been discussed, and I want to mention here the idea of the so-called ladder approach, which is frequently used by the ISFM researchers. They believe you start with a basic technology, you add one and you add another one and you add a third one, and eventually you reach the full CA system. But we believe that is probably not the best strategy, because if you're just starting with, for example, minimum soil disturbance or direct seeding, the soils indeed get hard and the benefits might be much less if we also integrate crop residue retention or rotation. So we believe that starting on a small field and expanding from there with all principles of CA is a much better strategy. What we found out quite clearly in the last 5 years or so is we need to have a better understanding of the farmer decision-making to guide us in the adoption process, because previously we used this binary adoption research. It has adopted, has not adopted, but it doesn't help us really in understanding the rationale, the reasons why things have been adopted or why not. And this is practically the centerpiece of terraces research. This really helps us understand why farmers adopt this system or why they are not. We learned that adoption is a gradual process and that farmers and also extension officers look at our technology in a very different way, and often not in a scientific way. There are cultural barriers, cultural beliefs, and norms in the community that also need to be understood and overcome. Agriculture without plowing is possible, but it has to be shown, it has to be experienced, and it has to be understood. Other biophysical research and research gaps we identified in the soil and root zone, which we could not fill due to lack of methods, tools, and sometimes lack of laboratory capacity. However, what we have available and what we continue to have available are long-term trials, both on station and on farm, which allowed us to more in-depth studies of CA systems and their climate smartness in the longer term. Samuel has taken on this challenge to better understand the development of the soil, specifically on soil aggregates, but also other chemical and biological factors. Another postdoc, Martin Kiefer, worked on the effects of long-term conservation agriculture management on root architecture, looking at drought-tolerant and non-drought tolerant maize varieties, which I believed was a key to understand CA responses under drought. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the linkages between Leeds research and the CGIAR. We believe that the research outlined in this presentation is very relevant and aligned very well with our research agenda, especially CIMMYT's research agenda. Some of the research that emerged out of this collaboration, for example, in the Stewart et al. Paper, The Adaptive Capacity of Maize-Based Conservation Agriculture System to Climate Stress in tropical and subtropical environments, a meta-regression of yields, has become very important research, a very important output, and is widely cited in the scientific world, and was hailed in 2019 as one of the top 10 research papers in the entire CGIAR. Increasingly, our research agenda has changed. We have also been asked to work on the adoption constraints, and the newly NORAD-funded ACASA project, which is a collaborative project between CIMMYT and IITA, focusing on the question why CA, although so beneficial, is not widely adopted. So this tallies very well with the research that Tilse was doing. Continued research on water and nutrient use efficiency and soil physical and chemical biological factors is indeed needed. However, I would believe there are more research gaps that have not been highlighted and need to be addressed in the next 5 to 10 years. How does CA and complementary practices address mitigation? We understand adaptation and productivity increase very well, but we know too little about mitigation benefits. What additional components in the systems are required to achieve greater climate smartness? How can we sustainably intensify current CA systems to increase productivity without affecting the environment? How does CA and CSA systems respond to specific pests and diseases? And I mention here the fall armyworm, which is just one example. The whole research about labor shortage is an important and very critical point of research, including the need for smallholder mechanization, because currently most of the Malawian smallholder farming systems are manual. And the research on smallholder appropriate scale mechanization is a next step in the research agenda. Previous long-term research mostly found biophysical benefits when practicing CA, and this has been well documented, but there's still a lack of knowledge about the economic benefits. Some of it we already started to publish, but more is needed. The effects of CA and climate smart agriculture on gender and youth is an emerging field of research and will need further attention. Likewise, nutrition benefits have rarely been looked at, and this is surprising as CA actually fosters diversification, which includes legumes and which should be more nutritious. Markets and private sector will play a pivotal role in getting CA more adopted or disadopted. Just an example, some years back, pigeon pea intercropping was introduced. It was widely adopted also in CA farming systems, but then there was a drop in the market for pigeon pea because the Indian market closed because of too much income of the pigeon peas from other places. And immediately the pigeon pea price dropped so dramatically that farmers basically did not know what to do with their pigeon pea grain anymore. So things around markets are important and they need to be understood. So we are not harming the farmers, but helping them to harness the pull effect from the markets for greater adoption. The political backing of CA and conservation agriculture is there. And but there are still too many conflicting policies that make a concerted effort difficult. This requires harmonization and policy research, which goes beyond just research on power relationships or political economy per se. It will require co-development of additional, more climate smart policies, including all stakeholders at all scales in the society. So in summary, so far I see a possible future of research, and I see a great potential between the universities of Malawi, CIMMYT, and the University of Leeds, especially in the areas of cutting edge research on soil science, where we need help. We sometimes don't have the equipment and the tools to do such kind of research. And we also need novel ideas that come from different angles. So these different perspectives sometimes are very helpful for us to guide a new research agenda. The research on adoption and farmer decision-making was a first step, and I think this was very critical and very important, but more needs to be done in that area. And I think for us, we are sometimes just locked here in our thinking and you know, getting more insights from researchers that have different perspectives, as I said, is so beneficial overall, and will be welcome in future projects or project phases that we might get. So I thank you very much for this opportunity to share my thoughts and views, and I'm hopefully we have a bit of a discussion right now and or responses to some of your questions. We will be happy to answer those.
Thank you, Christian. That was a fantastic response and summary of the talks. I believe, just correct me organizers otherwise, but I think we have time now till about a quarter past the hour for discussion, for response to questions. So I'll go straight to the Q&A bar and pick up some of these. The first one was addressed directly to you, Andy, and this was that the comment is, I would argue that one reason that CA adoption is low is because in the short term, financial analysis may not look attractive to a farmer, but broader socioeconomic analysis, the payoffs are great. So from a national standpoint, we really need to think of incentive mechanisms. What can you comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thank you, Isaac, for the question. I do think this cuts to the chase, as it were, in terms of how we assess the benefits of initiatives like conservation agriculture, that it shouldn't just be the short-term finances, but it needs to be the wider sort of benefits. I think we've all mentioned the benefits in terms of reduced labor demand, and in particular in households, especially female-headed households, where, you know, there's a lot of caring responsibilities with children and the like. There's often a lot of ill health. You know, we find that that is a key factor. So, you know, actually explaining this as part of a benefit and normalizing those labor-saving benefits as part of the advantages of CA is critical. The other thing I think there is, it's not just the link to modern inputs. So the Zambia example of greater uptake is partly been showing how with the link to direct inputs, fertilizers, new seed varieties has helped uptake, but equally there's opportunities with access to climate information. So getting the latest seasonal forecasts and really trying to explain that it isn't a backward form of agriculture. It might feel traditional, but actually if you're doing it alongside modern information, with climate information, with new seed varieties, etc., that this is the modern resilient future for the Malawian system. So I think it is the more rounded analysis, socioeconomic, as Isaac's put in the question, that is paramount. And our case studies and others are highlighting that. I think Christian highlighted that in terms of some mentioning some of the gender benefits that we might look at in the future. So definitely that's a key area that we're continuing to look at and we'll look at further. So thank you, Isaac. Steve, maybe just to say we can run a little past quarter past because we've got a lot of questions.
Yes, I know. And the suggestion to extend by 5 minutes is, as long as our panelists are happy to stay on for a little bit, I'm happy to continue a little bit too, because it looks like we have some really, really good points to discuss. I just wonder maybe on that point, if Christian or Tirza, do you have anything you want to add to the points that Andy made about incentives at national scale? You can move on to another question, but please jump in if you wish.
Well, I have a point on that. In other places, we have had the situation that CA adoption was tallied to fertilizer support or input support. And the moment this support dwindled, the adoption dwindled as well. So people were saying, okay, for sure, farmers will do it because you are giving them inputs. And I agree, for farmers, that is an economic strategy. To get the inputs, you do CA. But this never really led to a change in behavior or a new understanding of what we actually want to do with CA. And however, there are costs involved. We are asking farmers to do a more sustainable way of agriculture, which benefits the whole society, but they don't get any reward for that. If we look at, for example, siltation of the Malawi lake with soil that we could otherwise keep on site if we did CA everywhere, those farmers need to be rewarded for that. And there should be some form of a payment for environmental services. And this is something maybe that could maybe be explored in the next 5 to 10 years. It is already happening in the biodiversity discussion. Why not also in the agriculture sphere?
Okay. I think that there's just the second question that's in the chat bar right now is linked a little bit to this, which I also find very interesting, is not only barriers and pathways for adoption, but also challenges around abandonment, so that this is also a challenge that it could be taken up, but also high rates of abandonment. Now, is this, I guess I could maybe add to this, just try to represent the audience a little bit here. Does the panel feel, is this very much the same, just very much the same set of challenges, or is there some different points that need to come in around the challenge of abandonment once you could get an expansion of take-up of CA?
I think on that, Steve, a former PhD student of mine, Edna Chinzeo, who's at DARS, our partner in Lilongwe, did a really interesting study about disadoption in Malawi, and very much is the same sort of factors that, people will do as a project says for 5 years, 8 years, however long Total Land Care or CIMMYT or whoever are there. But then when they leave, they'll stop doing it. And actually what it's getting them to realize the benefits, partly in terms of their day-to-day livelihoods, but equally, and that's the issue about selling it, not just in terms of yield every year, but yield in the dry years, particularly labor saving benefits. So we did show in a study looking at people who disadopted in Malawi that it is very similar sort of reasons as to, the resistance to adopt in the first place. So, which in some ways is demoralizing that they don't see the benefits. And I think this is where the CIMMYT example is interesting, that, they had a plan for lead farmers and then, what they call mother farmers and then baby farmers following, and whether that leads to the learning across a community and sharing that by other routes. So sharing it through faith-based organizations, traditional leaders, as seeing, look at the benefits being seen there is critical. Christian, I know you've looked at similar things. If you want to.
I have a slightly different answer to this and a different perspective. What we see more and more in Southern Africa is that the farm communities are aging. They get older and older. Farmers are less and less interested to do this drudgery of farming. And that is related to the heavy labor burden on making ridges and doing the weeding and all what it is. So the young generation leaves. They go to town, they go to South Africa, they are not interested in farming. So what we really have to do also is bring those back to the farm. And the old people, they are slowly abandoning farming as well because they can't anymore. It's too much for them. And this landholding sizes get smaller and smaller, so they become less and less profitable for them. They cannot feed their families from it anymore. So farming becomes less and less attractive somehow. We have to change that around. if I knew the answer how to do it easily and quickly, I could propose it, but it's difficult. Some farms are 0.5 hectares currently in Malawi, and with all the labor involved, I can understand that the younger generation is not interested in that kind of farming anymore.
Thank you both. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is around, it's a mitigation or related to a mitigation question. It is a recent meta-analysis of Gwene et al. Have shown that focusing only on carbon sequestration without taking into account potential effect on N2O emissions could be misleading or counterproductive if the aim is to reduce greenhouse gas. Are you looking at this? Anyone speak up of the panel who wishes to tackle this one?
Yeah, I'll go with that.
Well, I mentioned this as one of the research gaps, but Samuel, maybe you want to add to this.
Yes, so it's important to consider the overall equivalent carbon balance rather than looking at carbon itself. But in our project, we didn't look at nitrous oxide, but we acknowledge that it is very, very important. But that doesn't mean that looking at the other indicators, because as I mentioned, having a good understanding of other indicators, for example, structure, will give you an idea. I can't remember the study now, but there's a link between improved structural properties and emission of nitrous oxide. So some of these indicators gives an idea of what happened. We didn't look at everything entirely. We agree that it is important, but it's a gap that needs to be considered. Yeah.
Good. Krista, did you want to add anything on those points?
I can add a little bit. We have a fully factorial trial looking at all principles in separation at several positions in Southern Africa. One of them is at the Harare UZ farm, University of Zimbabwe farm, where we measure a detailed nitrous oxides emissions with collaborators from CIRAT. So that is ongoing, not in Malawi at the moment yet, but could be in the future. This research is happening at other places, but will be published in due course.
Okay, great. There's a question here I'd like to possibly direct to Sam or Tirza if they want to have a try at it. Did you find that farmers have ethnopathological knowledge of different soil types across the landscape, or a preference for different soil types? Or are the soils fairly homogeneous?
I can go first.
Okay.
In my case, definitely. It was actually often used as an argument why, even though farmers saw on the trial what was happening and its benefit, that it was said that it would not work for themselves in their own context. And I think this fits quite well with some of the questions before, where there is a form of agriculture promoted, but it's everyone translates it to their own situation, looking at various elements of why it would or would not work. And so I think it would be very interesting to look, also addressing the previous questions, at how new forms of agriculture are promoted and how farmers are involved in that. And I think that can actually tell a lot also about, in terms of implementation or uptake of that.
Great.
Right. Yeah.
Does anyone want to add to the points, Sam?
Yeah, in Tanzania it's similar. So in the highland, in the east to Sambara Mountains, the soil parent material is similar. It's more of oxides and hydroxides of iron and aluminium, but the farmers know that the slope has impact on the type of soil. So they will tell you that top slope, that the water retention characteristics there is different than you would find in bottom slope. So they have those understanding. Yeah.
Okay, great. I like this question on the ladder additive technique. I agree that starting with no-till and adding the other principles of CA is not a good solution. But what about the other way around, starting with cover cropping, diversification, rotation that could be applied with conventional tillage, and then tillage can be reduced? Quite curious the response of the panel to that. I like the question a lot. Christian, you introduced that, yeah.
This is actually the much better strategy, but it is not implemented like that, unfortunately, in Southern Africa. Of course, if you have the cover crops, you increase your soil fertility already. You are able to maintain more ground cover gradually. You are able to introduce no tillage systems. This is exactly the strategy that could work. But the promotion here has been stop the plowing first, hope for some people to keep residues, and even less the rotation. And in this environment where we have a very strong crop livestock interaction, especially in Zambia and Zimbabwe, it is very challenging to keep residues, to introduce diversified crop rotation. And that's why it hasn't worked like that in this environment. But I totally agree with you, that would be the right strategy.
Right. I'm going to pick up one question here. Let me just see, my chat bar just jumped. I want to make sure I have it. This was a question directed to Christian. In developing countries, the intention of government is to minimize the total import of food products and to plan for self-sufficiency in food supply. To enhance land productivity, government promoted and even forced farmers to use chemical fertilizer, and we all know its impact on the sustainable productivity and health of soil. What is your reflection on the issue? You spoke on this a little bit, Christian, but perhaps you could expand a little bit on your thoughts there.
Yeah, well, there are researchers that highlighted that maybe we need fertilizer as the fourth principle of CA, which I disagreed with. But entirely, to be able to do conservation agriculture effectively in this part of the world, we need sufficient nutrient supply, be it through manure, fertilizer, or any other means. There has to be enough nutrients basically to produce, to generate the biomass and all of that. So I would agree with you that CA cannot be a no input system or a low input system. It has to be supported by complementary agriculture practices, including nutrients, including pest and disease control, including all other elements that you need, timely planting, good management, and so on, to be able to achieve that. But productivity has not been the primary target of CA in the past, and it is still not the primary target. It's more the other benefits that you can get from CA systems: reduced erosion, reduced degradation, reduced labor, you reduce power needs, and so on, and maybe adaptation to dry environments. That has been the past emphasis, but we need to maybe also increase the perspective on productivity.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to squeeze one more in and hope I don't get the plug pulled on our chat. I could go on for an hour like this. These are fantastic questions. I'd like to at least tackle this one because I think it's interesting. It brings livestock in. And it's a question that pasture cropping, especially using native forage grasses and drought-tolerant cereals and legumes, what is its potential and conservation agriculture options in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in arid and semi-arid dry lands? Does anybody want to tackle that one.
I don't want to dominate the panel, so please, maybe Andy, you can in.
I mean, it's been a focus of some of the AFRICAP work, looking at sort of mixed farming systems in terms of almost keeping animals for manure rather than for milk, and actually the value of what they produce being, you know, most valuable there, and linked to stall feeding and things like that. So definitely the Tanzanian example, that is very much the case, that those Fanyu terraces that Samuel showed is partly as a, you know, growing the grasses on there for then stall production and zero grazing cattle, almost with a view to manure production as the key element. I think within the CA systems of Malawi, it's been a very small proportion. There's very low levels of cattle use. I was always struck, having done a PhD down in Botswana, where everywhere you look there is cattle. You know, when you go to Malawi, it is not the same, and there isn't the opportunities for that in the same regard. Definitely though, with goats and you know, small stock, then there are opportunities there in terms of creating more manure and seeing that as one of the innovations for the future. So it's an area where more work is needed, and yeah, where ongoing collaborations to do more on those kind of things.
Okay, great. Let's draw things to a close now. We've got an extra 10 minutes out of everybody. Much of the participants were able to stick with us for this long. I just want to thank the panelists again very much, and the audience as well, for the great questions. And Christian, especially for your role as respondent, thank you very much for your contribution today. Just pause for a moment if the organizers want to add any points before we close the meeting.
Can I just highlight some things, Steve, from the AFRICAP project perspective, as well as adding my thanks to colleagues. One is that for anybody interested in these issues, AFRICAP as a project is about to start running a MOOC on climate change and resilience in food systems, with a focus on Southern Africa and East Africa. So that starts through the Future Learn platform from March 29th, but you can find details on the AFRICAP website. The other thing to note is we're running a series of monthly webinars like this, and the next one sounds very interesting to me. Susie Salu and Harriet Smith, who've led a lot of the work in Tanzania, are going to present on climate smart agriculture implementation, looking at innovation, inclusivity and capacity building with more of a Tanzanian perspective so that's on March the 25th. And finally, just a note of thanks partly to Tierza and Samuel, obviously, for their hard work in putting the slides together, but these slides will be available. So the project team, through either Lauren or Helen, who've guided us through, will be in touch with everybody who signed up for the webinar and will provide the slides and the link. As I said, there is a briefing note on the AFRICAP website, and Tierza's paper on a lot of what she presented is due out any day now. So hopefully we can share that as well with those who joined in.
Great, I think we've finished then. So I will close the meeting, and thanks again to everybody for attending.
Okay, all the best to you.